You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City, and I'm delighted to be joined on the first podcast of the new decade here in 2020 by Shannon Tiesi, the Diplomats editor-in-chief. How are you doing, Shannon?
Great, Ankit. It's always a pleasure to join you on the podcast.
Yeah, and it's good to kick off with you on the episode. And, longtime listeners probably know that whenever we have Shannon on, we're going to talk about something related to China, or as the case will be on this episode, Taiwan. So 2020 is gearing up to be a year of elections. Yes, the United States is, of course, going to the polls in November to elect potentially a successor to Donald Trump. That's the election that basically the whole world is watching closer than anything else. But in Asia, we have a number of elections coming up this year. South Korea is going to the polls on April 15th for legislative elections. Singapore's probably going to the polls in May or possibly even earlier. Myanmar is supposed to have general elections later. Even Hong Kong, which was bereft by protests throughout 2019, is slated to have legislative council elections. But before all of that happens, we're getting this year kicked off with one of Asia's most vibrant democracies, with a very contentious democratic debate, certainly ahead of any election, and that is, of course, Taiwan. The Taiwanese people are going to the polls on January 11th. We're recording this on January 6th, just a few days before, to elect another president, potentially re-electing the incumbent, President Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, or her main opponent, Kaohsiung Mayor Han Kuo-yu with the Kuomintang. So, Shannon, I'm just hoping that we can spend this episode talking through, what makes this presidential election so important for Taiwan. So, do you want to just walk us through a little bit of, what exactly has happened, the broad picture of the last 4 years in Taiwan and what the stakes are with this election, not only for cross-strait ties, certainly Taiwan's own domestic situation and economic situation, but just broadly. What do you see as the stakes in this election?
Well, I think to fully understand what's going on, we have to go back a little bit further than 5 years. We should go back, I think, to 2014, which is when the Sunflower Movement broke out in Taiwan. And that was, there were a number of factors at play, but one of the major driving forces behind that was the cross-strait question. Essentially, the Ma Ying-jeou government, which was in power in Taiwan at the time, had created this economic deal with China on cross-strait trades and services that got a lot of backlash from the public in Taiwan. And it really sparked this broader conversation of what should the public and the legislature, what should their role be in the cross-strait dynamic? Because before then, it had basically been entirely in the hands of the executive branch and the president. So what should their role be? And really the more fundamental question of how close should Taiwan look to get with mainland China? And there's obviously a lot of ways to look at that issue. In the case of the Sunflower Movement, there was a sense that economically it was bad for Taiwan, that would essentially kind of hollow out Taiwan's economy by allowing these Chinese businesses to flood in. But also, once Taiwan became even more economically dependent on China, that would have negative national security ramifications. So in the wake of that, you started seeing some really landslide victories for the DPP, which, as you noted, is Tsai Ing-wen's party. And it's traditionally called the Pro-Independence Party because technically the party charter has never updated itself to from saying that it seeks an independent Taiwan. But really, you haven't seen mainstream DPP politicians agitating for independence in quite some time. And certainly Tsai Ing-wen has not done that. So just to caveat the sort of pro-independence label. But regardless of that, there is a sense that the DPP is going to take a much more cautious attitude toward Taiwan's relationship with China. And the voters really showed that they preferred that. Compared to Ma Ying-jeou, KMT, their sort of warmer embrace of China. So Tsai Ing-wen was swept into power in a massive victory over her rival of the KMT. And the DPP won legislative control, which is something that they had never had before. So it sort of looked at the time that the Kuomintang was dead in the water, that its approach on particularly cross-strait affairs, but also broader economic policy had effectively killed it off, and that the party would not be able to recover. And then we saw the local elections of 2018. And that was a big surprise
Yeah.
for a lot of people. Yeah, the KMT actually came out on top, and one of the shock victors was Han Kuo-yu, who won in Kaohsiung, which had long been a DPP stronghold. So then the question was, okay, maybe the KMT is back, and they're a force to be reckoned with, and the DPP is now on the defensive. And since then, the pendulum has swung back. Han Kuo-yu went from a massive lead in the polls over Tsai earlier this year to now a massive deficit, and he's down by 20 to 30 percentage points in polls, depending on what you're looking at and how recent the polls are.
So pretty
So
much, everybody, the conventional wisdom going into this election is that, as you said, Tsai Ing-wen is very well positioned to win. And so, what are some of the factors that in the last year, in 2019, led to that dramatic reversal of fortunes for Han Kuo-yu? I mean, I remember, a year ago, everybody was, you were reading articles kind of in, not at the Diplomat, but many other places, calling Han Kuo-yu kind of the Trump of Taiwan, and, everybody should be ready for a big upset. But of course, one of the big factors people have been talking about is the reaction that Taiwan has had to what's been happening in Hong Kong for the last 6 months or so. So is that really it? I mean, how much of this is explained by the Hong Kong situation, or are there other factors at work as well?
I think Hong Kong has a lot to do with it. And if you looked at a chart of the opinion polling, you can see that Han's lead really disappears right around the same time that the Hong Kong protests get going, right around early June. And then he comes back a little bit in July and then just kind of nosedives from there. So that's definitely part of it. It's not only that the Hong Kong protests really sort of reminded the Taiwanese public what's at stake in their relationship with China and what one country, two systems could look like for Taiwan in a very negative sense. But also the KMT and Han in particular really bungled their response. Initially, when Han was being asked about it, he denied that he had any idea what was happening in Hong Kong. He said he didn't know much about it, whereas Tsai and her government came out very much on the offensive, saying we support the Hong Kong protesters. We reject one country, two systems as a model for Taiwan. Being very forward-leaning in their response, and clearly that resonated with the Taiwanese public. But I think there's other factors at play, and one of them is that Han Kuo-yu was basically a blank slate. He was essentially an unknown political figure when he rode this massive wave of populist support to victory in the Kaohsiung mayor election. And I think that expectations for him have come back down to earth a little bit now that people are actually seeing how he governs, which frankly I think has been disappointing for a lot of people because he made a lot of fairly unrealistic promises about how he was going to completely turn around Kaohsiung's economy and sign all of these deals with mainland China and make Kaohsiung rich again. And that hasn't really panned out. And part of that is because he's been focusing on the presidential campaign. The residents of Kaohsiung many of them are very displeased with the way he's been governing. But also I think people are realizing that some of his rhetoric doesn't translate very well to action. So there's a combination of both those factors. People are now becoming more familiar with Han Kuo-yu. He's losing a little bit of that shine and that image that he had built for himself. And then you have the Hong Kong factor as well, which is pulling people toward Tsai Ing-wen.
Mm-hmm. And of course, on New Year's Day, I think President Tsai delivered a very, clear-cut analysis of the situation in Hong Kong and its meaning for Taiwan. She said, "Hong Kong people have showed us that one country, two systems is definitely not feasible." And she continued, "Under one country, two systems, the situation continues to deteriorate in Hong Kong. The credibility of one country, two systems has been sullied by the government's abuse of power." And of course, I think that's really been sort of my take too. That this Hong Kong thing has really, I think, blown back in Taiwan. So one of the takeaways I think a lot of people, including myself, had from the 2016 elections and Tsai Ing-wen's victory, which, as you correctly noted, really does date back to the political forces that were set into motion by the Sunflower Movement, was the assertion of Taiwanese identity, the Taiwanization of Taiwanese politics, and the rise of the DPP. How much are these questions of identity now, really being contested? Because obviously, you've covered this a lot for us at the Diplomat. China has really taken off the gloves in crunching Taiwan under the DPP's tenure, right? So everything from poaching diplomatic allies to making Taiwan's economic life as difficult as possible. The old strategy of using carrots and sticks to maintain the cross-strait relationship. When the KMT's in power, more carrots, but the DPP, we see more sticks. So looking ahead, let's just assume that Tsai Ing-wen is going to win as the polls project. What do you think happens? I mean, if she does win with the kind of mandate that most people seem to be predicting, I mean, what does that mean for the cross-strait relationship and for Beijing's approach towards Taipei?
Um, I think obviously the kind of the best case scenario, unfortunately, is that Beijing is going to continue along the same track that it has. In terms of really restricting Taiwan's participation in any sort of international forum. One thing that we might see is Beijing leaning harder to get Taiwan even not invited to the APEC summits, which Taiwan is actually a member of because that is based on economies and not statehood. So Hong Kong, for example, also sends its own representative. But there's been rumors in the past that Beijing would refuse to allow Taiwan to send a representative or lean on the whatever the host government is, not to invite Taiwan. And we could see something like that, really upping the ante of trying to drive Taiwan out of any international fora where it's represented. Definitely more pressure on Taiwan's diplomatic allies and trying to induce them to change. I think a worst case scenario would be that Taiwan's in such a landslide, and it seems directly related to the cross-strait question that China's leadership really sort of gives up hope that Taiwan can ever be peacefully reunified. And obviously, the question of will Taiwan be invaded by the mainland is a perennial issue of concern for analysts. I don't think that's very likely. Xi Jinping has more than enough on his plate without adding an invasion of Taiwan to the mix. What we could see, however, and this is something that happened during the previous DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, he came to office hoping for at least a semi-friendly relationship with Beijing. He was willing to work with them. He got the cold shoulder. When he was reelected, he sort of threw in the towel and said, okay, I played nice with China and they haven't given me anything in return. So then he really upped the ante. You started hearing talk about referendums about whether Taiwan should be an independent country, which is a huge red line for Beijing. I don't think we will see that with Tsai. She has been incredibly pragmatic and embraced, the status quo is essentially her cross-strait policy. I want to keep the status quo. But the temptation will be there, if this more muscular policy and, as you said, very frank outlining of what she views as the threat from China seems to win her a lot of public supports and has political benefits, there's going to be a huge temptation to push the envelope even further.
Of course, the X factor in all of this is the United States in many ways. I think, needless to say, the first few days of 2020 have already shown us that probably more so, going to the fourth year of the Trump presidency, President Trump's instincts are really sort of, there are no real, there are no guardrails anymore. The president's instincts are finding their way into policy. And Trump himself has had an interesting, back and forth on Taiwan, everything from treating Taiwan as a bargaining chip in trade talks potentially to sort of, being the president that's willing to upend Taiwanese, U.S.-Taiwan relations in big ways. He certainly, has assented to major defense deals last year. 2019 marked the 40th year, of course, of the Taiwan Relations Act. But, if Tsai Ing-wen does win, and this is, sort of asking you to do the impossible and predict the unpredictable, but how do you expect, what could the United States potentially do that could really rock this boat? I mean, regardless of what happens, the U.S. is going to have to react to the election result in Taiwan. And I just have some dark thoughts about things that the United States could do potentially, especially given the current environment in U.S.-China trade talks, and depending on where things go, even with North Korea potentially, Taiwan does again, I think, take on additional importance, potentially playing that role again of a bargaining chip between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, I think that's been a huge concern, especially among the Taiwanese, is that Trump essentially sees Taiwan as something he can use as leverage to get other things that he wants from China, and that is exactly what Taiwan does not want to be, because then essentially what you're signaling is that there is a price, and if China is willing to pay that price, in terms of trade concessions, or other things, South China Sea, North Korea come to mind, then that Trump would abandon Taiwan. I think there are enough figures in his administration who have been pro-Taiwan that we haven't seen that concern come to fruition. As you noted, we've seen some very muscular defense sales, including approving the sale of F-16s to Taiwan, which for a long time has been more or less unthinkable. But now you've also seen a lot of turnover. Randy Shriver being one notable exception. He was very pro-Taiwan, very friendly toward Taiwan, and now he's no longer at the Department of Defense. And as you said, Trump's administration is inherently unpredictable, and it seems like he is taking more assertive control and less willing to be guided by what his advisors are saying. So we definitely can't rule out that he's going to do something or say something, put Taiwan on the table as the U.S. and China enter their phase two trade talks, which is supposed to happen at some point this year. But if Tsai Ing-wen wins election, you're really seeing continuity. And I wouldn't expect a drastic change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the U.S. election at the end of the year. If we get a new administration here, we might see a shift in U.S. policy toward Taiwan as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one other issue that so in our not the most recent issue, but in the December 2019 issue of the Diplomats magazine, we had a cover article by Russell Shao of the Global Taiwan Institute, looking at the mainland's efforts to interfere in Taiwanese democracy, including efforts by the Communist Party's sort of United Front Work Department to foster pro KMT sentiment and really kind of work to hurt the DPP in the elections. Of course, as the polls suggest, many of those interference efforts haven't really been successful. But certainly, I think Russell made a very, I thought, compelling case that these efforts have intensified under the last 4 years of DPP leadership under Tsai Ing-wen. Is this something that you see? Maybe China sort of rethinking or perhaps employing different tactics going forward to better influence Taiwanese democracy? I mean, obviously, I think Taiwan has shown that its institutions are quite robust, and of course, there have been legal measures taken in Taiwan to prevent the effectiveness of some of these measures, including the anti-infiltration law. But how do you make sense of the efforts by the mainland to interfere in Taiwanese democracy?
I think this is an evolution of long-standing attempts by China to win over various stakeholders within Taiwan, whether that means business people, local government officials. As Russell outlined in his article, a lot of times this is done through temples, educational exchanges, various things like that. And now they've really moved it onto a much broader scale by going online and using the tools of social media to reach a wider audience. There's tons of stories you can find about content farms that are essentially churning out fake news that is then disseminated on Taiwanese websites or even sometimes picked up by news outlets because Taiwan has sort of a wild, wild west media atmosphere that competition is so tense. There's a lot of pressure to pick up flashy stories without vetting them properly and just run with them and get the clicks and get the attention. So I think China is always fine-tuning and tinkering with its United Front, influence operations in Taiwan and really around the world. So definitely they're going to see how this election goes and then reevaluate what their tactics have been. I think a big part of this election is that it's been very openly talked about, these influence operations, and that's obviously kind of having a backlash effect that is probably winning Tsai Ing-wen some support. So China might take a step back, rethink, maybe try and find more covert ways of accomplishing the same thing, and maybe try more of extending the carrots to these local level leaders and business people and exchanges to win support there. But we're just going to have to wait and see what the results are and how China interprets them, which those two things might not be as intuitively related as we might think.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think, with just a few days away, we'll have the results. But Shannon, thanks a lot for joining me today to break down, this very important election for Taiwan. It's certainly a great discussion to kick off the year and the decade.
Yeah, this is it's going to be an interesting way to start off January with a major election in Taiwan that'll have huge ramifications for the cross-strait relationship and, ultimately for the U.S.-China-Taiwan triangle, which is always of major interest.
That's right. And for listeners, actually, I will take this opportunity to plug the recent issue of the Diplomats magazine for January. As has been tradition in recent years, we've asked many of our contributors, including Shannon and myself, to chime in on some of the developments to watch and expect in the year ahead. So if you're curious on what you should be keeping your eye on around the Asia Pacific, definitely check that out. That's really, I think, a valuable resource. So we've had some really good people putting out some great analysis in there. So yeah, once again, Shannon, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Ankit. It's always a pleasure.
Great. And for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Certainly, I hope you'll keep the Diplomats Asia Geopolitics podcast on your podcast roll for 2020 and beyond. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers. We really appreciate that. And finally, before we close, just a quick note from the sponsor of this episode. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.